Now, some have said that Nigeria in 2025 is where the democratic hopes of 1999 came to die. Well, that might be too much doom and gloom, but it would not be an exaggeration to say that Nigeria is in the middle of a rule of law recession. This is characterized by the tightening of the space for media and civil society, declining trust in institutions, the prevalence of authoritarian governance, the crackdown on the internet, which is of course a direct crackdown on citizens, and the heavy hand of the executive upon the judiciary. All you've got to do is listen to the news or pick up the paper or go online and you'll see all the headlines about the decline. But how do you cut through the histrionics of all the news reports and make sense of what's actually happening out there? Well, a common and very legitimate theme of that democracy pinch is the decline in the lofty concept of the rule of law, which should be the foundation of this country's democracy. So if the reality of the Nigerian landscape is that the rule of law is declining, how much does that challenge us to redouble our efforts and to embrace this new paradigm that's being advocated of people-centered justice? Well, one of the big international advocates of this people-oriented justice system is the internationally respected Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, based in the Netherlands. For the first time in its history, it has a Nigerian CEO. His name is Jude, and he joins me now in the studio. Congratulations are in order.
Thank you very much.
We always like to see Nigerians doing well internationally.
Thank you.
Of course, people know you in Nigeria very well because, I mean, you set a very good precedent for yourself and for Nigerians in the civil society space before you moved on, as they say, although I suppose you're straddling both countries now. But we're going to talk about you and how you got to that position, as well as what your organization, which is a very well-respected group, does. But before we do that, let's talk about broadly speaking, the rule of law, which is pretty much, to some extent what you do, and that is what it is supposed to represent. I mean, it represents who we are, our values, our democracy, but rule of law does not mean rule by law. Because there is a big difference, isn't there? And that's where your concern comes in. Tell us more.
Thank you, Charles, for the difficult questions as usual.
Well, we reckon that you lost your hair because you're just too intelligent. So you might as well start sort of answering all those questions.
Yeah, but the truth, Charles, is that this whole recession of the rule of law is not a phenomenon peculiar to Nigeria. We're increasingly seeing across the globe a major regression in democratic principles and the values we've come to hold sacred back in the days. The global world order is in tatters. We don't recognize it. We see what is happening across the world. Countries are no longer submitting themselves to those principles of the international law, so to say.
Multilateralism.
Exactly.
Dying.
So countries are looking more insular. Relationship at international level is now primarily based on personal interests rather than values. And we are seeing increasingly an a la carte respect for rules. If it works for me, it's fine. If it doesn't work for me, then it's not fine. And so the hypocrisy and the contradictions at the global level are really frightening.
Right.
And now added to that is this new attempt to redefine democracy to mean something else. And so you hear things like, because people are voted into power, then they cannot be restrained by the judiciary, which of course is one man. And to them, how can one man restrain my power when I've been voted by millions of people? We are seeing narratives like that. We are seeing narrative about, it is interest of national security, therefore I'm allowed not to follow precedents. And this is happening in places where we've never imagined it will happen. From the United States, for instance, we're seeing things like that happen. And so the first worry is that the value system is unrecognizable, and countries can take advantage of this confusion to begin to dismantle the structures of the rule of law, just like you mentioned. And so, when you come down to our own country, we're also seeing this trend where there is no consistency in the way the law is applied.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Nigeria, because it is a good example. It has, for instance, a constitution that's written, and if you look there, you'd probably see a delicate balance in the separation of powers, but the reality is quite different, because I don't know what your thoughts are, but there is a lack of a culture of law here. That's the sense that one gets. So can it be said that in this country, the rule of law has been weaponized to undermine the justice system to some extent?
I would say rather that the inconsistency in the applications of principles of the Constitution is undermining the credibility of the judicial system. That's the way I will frame it. And what I'm trying to say here is that people do not have trust in the judicial system. And for good reasons, because of that inconsistency. So if you look at, for instance, the election petition process, the judgments that came out from the various tribunals, the contradictory nature of some of those decisions, and the inability of the system to rein in some of the rogue judges who have done some of these reprehensible things in the process, then you get the sense that, why should I go to court? Can I find justice here? Is it for the highest bidder? And so when you begin to erode the trust in the judicial process, the credibility of that process, then you cannot sustain the rule of law, because the rule of law implies that everybody is subject to law, and that you and I, who may not be in government, are protected by the system. And that when people go outside of the ambit of their power as authority, as elected officials or security officials, whatever, that the system can rein them in and provide adequate compensation for me if I was the one that been victimized, and adequate restraint by those people. But there's something else, Charles. There is also a culture of restraint, which the rule of law expects, which democracy expects. And that means simply that you do not have to exercise your power in its ultimate limit. Because when you do that, it could become destructive. And that's where you hear about guardrails, about principles, about conventions, about traditions, which are not written by law, but which simply implies that we need to respect each other and respect the limits of our own powers as government officials.
You know, when we talk about the culture of law, the reason I mentioned that was that because Nigeria came out of the crush of military rule, and we had the sort of the giddiness and the euphoria and the promises that came with the advent of democracy. But what we learned was that this sort of demilitarization did not lean inexorably towards true democracy. In other words, the country was seized by sort of pseudo-authoritarian regimes that were operating under the toga of democracy. And that ultimately raised the question of the rule of law in this country today.
That is very correct. The transition from military to civilian regime doesn't necessarily mean transition from authoritarianism to democracy. Democracy is built on a set of principles. Democracy is built on a culture of values, which I believe that we are still a work in progress.
Right.
So it's not yet eureka for us to say that we found the solution.
Right. So if the reality of the Nigerian landscape is that the rule of law is declining, or at least is not going in the opposite direction, how much does that challenge us to redouble our efforts and to embrace this new paradigm that I'm going to get to in a moment, which your organization advocates, which is people-centered justice?
So it is interesting to talk about this, because democracy is about people. The whole essence of the social contract is that we come together and imbue on one set of individuals our collective power, And we say to them, exercise this in trust for us. Meaning that, just as the Constitution said, sovereignty lies with the people. That is why we have what we call servant leaders. And the principle of democracy is built on that paradigm, that the people are sovereign. And so democracy is about the people, meaning development should be about the people, meaning that governance should be about the people. And of course, justice should be about the people.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And that brings me to your organization, the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, or HAIL. Very well respected internationally. Tell us more about it and why you think it is relevant to Nigeria.
Yes. We've been around for almost 20 years. And from the conceptualization of the institutes, it was about finding creative and new solutions to solving justice problems. And part of what we found out over the years, of course, is that a lot of times the justice system is designed without due consideration and understanding of the justice needs of the people. And so people feel a sense of disconnection between the justice system and themselves.
You can say that again.
Yes.
When it comes to Nigeria.
And we focus a lot on the physical structures of justice and not the value structures of justice. And so what we've done over the years, for instance, is that we do what we call justice needs survey, which we've done in 27 countries. And it tells us something interesting. Everywhere you go, the justice needs are different. And for you to then have an effective and efficient and credible justice system, the justice system has to be tailored in every locality, in every country, to suit the peculiar needs of the people.
And presumably you've done that study in Nigeria as well.
Yes.
Right. And from what I read, I think it took you 3 years.
Yes.
So that's very comprehensive.
Yes.
I mean, you spoke to thousands of people.
Yes, that is correct.
Tell us more.
So we did the first justice needs survey in Nigeria in 2018. And part of what came out of that survey, for instance, was one that people prefer to sort out their justice needs in informal settings rather than go to court.
Right.
And one of the most informal of the settings was the police. So for civil matters, people would rather go to the police to say, oh, recover my money from my neighbor, than go to court. And
is that because they had less trust in the court system?
Because of
or
the
they're
time,
just alienated
because
from
of the time,
right.
because of the costs, because
right.
they don't understand it.
Right.
And of course they know that if you go with the percentage principle, the police gets your money back and you have to pay something to them.
Yeah.
But when we did the last longitudinal survey, which we had about 4,000 subjects in 18 states across the 6 geopolitical zones. So we asked them a set of questions in 2022, same question 2023, same question 2024, to understand the trajectory.
Right.
So a couple of things came out. One of which is that, again, a lot of people prefer the informal system to resolve their justice needs. 90% of Nigerians have justice problems that they tackle. And when people use the informal system to resolve their needs, a lot of times that resolution doesn't hold because there is no statutory or judicial stamp on it.
Yes.
And so it falls through over the years. Then the other thing is the prevalence of domestic and gender violence, which also came out clearly from the study that this is a problem. Now, what was remarkable, really, is that the churches, traditional rulers, neighborhood organizations are providing greater number of justice service to people because people trust them.
Right.
They are close to them.
So they were more like in arbitration, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd rather go to these people to resolve my need
Yes.
than go to court. And that is a good and bad news. It is a good news because at least we now see a system that works. And we as a country can say, let us invest in ensuring that this informal system of justice is supported in a way that is sustainable.
Right.
It has some good standards and it's closer to the people.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I was going to ask you, how is this people-centered justice relevant to the things that matter to Nigerians? Things like security, economic development, nation building.
Exactly. So take, for instance, tenant-landlord relationship and the amount of time it takes to go to court to resolve them. And imagine a situation where these things can be resolved in a circle of trust in the locality where they live. You're shaving off hours and millions of naira that's going to be spent in the court process. Take, for instance, small businesses who are daily grappling with their wares being seized, multiple taxation, difficulty in registration, and you have a system that opens up a pathway for them to have all of these things resolved, close, very, very close to their point of need, transparently, and even sometimes with technology. It frees up time, it frees up resources. Take, for instance, communal crisis that we see all the time, land dispute that we see all the time, and the ability of our systems to deal with those land crises without going to court. That we're using the good office of our traditional rulers, our pastors, our imams, our elders, just like they did in the olden days, to resolve this thing. And that we create a system in our law that recognizes those resolutions, respects them, and creates some level of standard across board. So that, of course, crazy people cannot do crazy things all in the name of resolving this matter. And so when you do that, you are strengthening community bonds, which is fundamental to safety and security. You are supporting small businesses who are then able to resolve their justice need a little bit quickly, and they're able to thrive. But most importantly, you are getting government to listen to the people.
Right.
And that gives them some sense of ownership in the justice system, in the way they are governed, and in the future of this country.
Well, I mean, that's the theory, and you've put it out very well. But, I mean, how is Hill expecting to practicalize that in Nigeria? And since I've asked you that question, I'd have to ask you again, what more can we expect from Hill in this country?
Okay.
Briefly, because we're almost out of time.
Okay, so...
And I want to talk about how you got your job, because you're impressing me.
So, we have done this in Niger, for instance. I'll give you an example. So in Niger, 23% of the population say that one of their biggest problems is land disputes. And of course, you understand the insurgency, the movement of people. But they have the local traditional rulers who sit in these disputes and they're able to resolve this matter quickly. But there were no standards.
Right.
Everybody is. So what we did there was, one, bring the people together, local traditional rulers, government officials, experts, and all that, to sit down and ask the question, what kind of guidelines can we put in place that will help us to have some commonalities in the way we resolve these matters? And they developed their guidelines themselves, and they adopted it. And the Ministry of Justice comes and says, we're standing behind this. We want to make sure that more local chiefs are able to do this. We want to make sure that we've got a bit of standard across the country. We want to make sure that this is enforceable. And that is you dealing with the justice need of 23% of your population. So in Nigeria, we've experimented and now experimenting in Ogun State, where we have the one-stop shop for survivors of gender-based violence. What was the problem we found out in Ogun? Women had a problem retelling their story about their suffering. So they feel re-victimized every time they tell the story. And they created it themselves to say, if you have a one-stop shop where we come, we tell the story once, but the system then takes it and provides solutions to what we need. And that is happening. In Imo State, they said, we've got this problem of accessing the formal courts. And so they're pioneering the community justice centers, which is like a kiosk in your neighborhood, like where you buy your recharge card. When you got your issues, you go to the kiosk. You got a lawyer there, and you ask the question, this has happened, what should I do? Lawyer can say, go get your neighbor. Oh, hey, maybe you shouldn't do it this way, we can resolve this here. Or it can say, I think you should go to your traditional ruler. Or maybe you should go to the magistrate court. But,
very, very interesting.
But that's a clearinghouse sort of that helps us to get people to resolve their issues or direct them on how to resolve them.
I hope this thing gets a lot more airing because it's a very interesting concept, and in fact a lot of people have been kind of peripherally talking about this, but yours is supported by data, which is very important.
Yes.
How did you get the job of CEO of Hill? I mean, you were picked out of many others.
Well, the simple answer is that I applied. I applied for.
Well, you applied from the Netherlands. You
Yes,
were already
I
there.
mean, I was in the Netherlands. I
Yeah.
was the interim executive director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict. I had a 12-month spell on that job, and while it was winding down, the opportunity of Hill came up.
Yes.
And I threw in my application because I mean I was excited by this whole thing about data, this whole thing about new approaches to justice,
Yes.
and about people. I mean, that's democracy, of course. That's the interpretation
Absolutely.
of democracy. Yeah, and I think one of the things that helped was the lived reality of being in an environment like ours where we confront some of these challenges on a daily basis and where we understand it. So I wasn't going to theorize about the challenges of assessing justice.
Right.
I've lived it. And I guess combined with my own limited experiences, I must say, and my lived reality, and my hope and enthusiasm that this is a solvable problem, since we already know the cause of the problem and we know what people want. Let's bridge that gap. And so I think that was why they decided to give me the job.
Well, I'm glad you got it, and thank you very much indeed for coming in to talk to us. Jude Ilo is the Nigerian CEO, the first one, by the way, of the internationally respected Hague Institute for Innovation of Law. It's based in the Netherlands. Thank you very much indeed. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.